Okay, good afternoon. This is Mr. Murray. I'm coming to you on March 31st, 11:30. This will be primarily for seventh graders. Today we're going to go over Anne Frank, specifically Act 2, Scenes 2 and 3. I put these notes on Google Slot or Google Classroom. So if you go to Google Classroom, if you missed some of this, or if you'd rather just read the summaries on the website. There's also a quiz for Act 2, Scene 2, and a quiz for Act 2, Scene 3, as well as a graphic organizer and I think vocabulary. I'll go over those in a little bit more detail as we go. Hi, Nathaniel, I saw you popped on. I was just going over I put these notes on the Google Classrooms. I also put the summaries that I'm going to go over on the classroom as well. So if you want to go there to look at it, you can look at it while I talk, or you can look at it later if you feel like it. But that stuff's all there for you. Hi, Nick. I see you here also. Okay, so we're actually since spring break's coming up pretty soon, I want to make sure we get done with the play this week. So I'm going to go kind of quick. Luckily, the fifth scene is super short, so we should be able to get through Act 2, Scene 2, and probably 3 today, and then just do 4 and 5 on Thursday. So I'm going to go kind of quick, but not so quick that I don't go over everything that's on the quiz. Okay, so Act 2, Scene 2 begins with Anne preparing for her date with Peter. We also know that Peter is preparing for his visit with Anne. I'm sorry, one second. Act 1's also on there. So I think there's a summary for Act 1 also. If not, I'll go back and make sure it's there. If you missed me summarizing Scene 1, you can always go back to our earlier video. It would have been last week's. And again, the play is on the Google Classroom, so is the text version and an audio version. So if you need to watch it, listen to it, or you want to just read it, all those options are there too. Plus there's a summary, or you can go back to the video of me discussing it, whichever one. But all of the quizzes should be there. There should be a quiz for each act. Okay, that's fine. There's no like hard due date for when these things are due. Just as you get them done, don't feel like overwhelmed just because you see me adding things and Miss Miller adding things. Just do them as you can. But try to get some stuff done so something to grade, obviously. Anyway, so this scene begins with Anne and Peter both getting ready for their date. So their date's really just going to consist of Anne going into Peter's room. He's going to serve her some pop, and they're going to have a conversation. But it's still a pretty big deal to both of the teenagers because it's kind of like an escape, right? They're stuck in this attic. There's nowhere really to go. There aren't any other people their age to talk to other than Margaret, and it's just like it's kind of like a fun escape. So we know Anne's looking forward to this. She's spending a lot of time getting dressed. She's talking with Margo. She gives some self-doubt, mentioning that she doesn't think she's pretty. She also is concerned that Margo might actually be jealous of her and Peter's relationship. Margo expresses that she's not actually jealous of Peter, but she's jealous of the fact that Anne has something to do. So you get like some nice back and forth between the two sisters, which the play doesn't give you a lot of material on how Anne and Margo get along. So this kind of gives you a little bit more into their relationship. So like Margo, even though she's a little bit jealous of Anne having something to do, she's helping her get dressed. She gives her a few compliments when Anne says she doesn't think she's pretty. She mentions that she's very animated and she has lovely eyes, I think. But not like super close, but like civil type of relationships. Nick, tell you what, I'll get back to you as we go on the chat, all right? Just so I don't like keep stopping. 1 through 5's all on the Google Classroom though. So if you go to the Google Classroom, you should be able to like see those quizzes and the The summaries also are on there. So if you're having trouble with that, when I'm done with this, I'll message back and forth with you a bit. So anyways, back to the scene. So they actually, on her way to the date, we get a couple of conflicts. We get Anne versus Dussel, and this is like a man versus man. Even though Anne's a girl, it still counts as man versus man. And this is over control of the room. So Anne's spending all this time getting prepared. Even though Dussel's going to have the room to himself as soon as she's done, they still have this conflict where he doesn't like being forced out of the room that they share. It's kind of both of their safe place. It's his safe place to go because, again, he's a loner and he doesn't get along with people. And it's Anne's place to prepare for her date. So they're both kind of arguing over control of the room. Anne and Miss Frank have a conversation. And this demonstrates kind of the conflict of trust versus appearance. So Anne believes her mother doesn't trust her because she wants the door to remain open when she visits Peter. Mrs. Frank assures her that's not so much that she doesn't trust Anne or Peter, it's that she doesn't want the appearance of something inappropriate happening. And it also kind of shows her inability to stand up to Mrs. Van Damme, who's making a lot of really snide comments. And rather than standing up to her and defending her daughter, Mrs. Frank's just kind of quiet anytime Van Damme makes one of these comments. We know that Anne doesn't like the fact that her mother lets people push her around. She mentions that to Margo a few times. And that just shows that conflict between the daughter and the mother. Another conflict that we see is Mrs. Frank and Mrs. Van Damme is the idea of older generations versus younger generations' values. So Mrs. Frank is more modern in the sense that Mrs. Van Damme has much older values. She thinks it's improper for a girl to go to a boy's room. She thinks the boy should be going to the girl. And she articulates all of these. Mrs. Frank is unable or unwilling to stand up to her. And this failure to stand up to Van Damme really kind of hurts her relationship with her daughter. When they actually do finally get into their date, she goes into his room. He has saved pop, apparently. So he pours pop, kind of like they're having almost like a fake adult date where he's pouring a drink for her. And then they just sit and talk. One of the themes to this scene is kind of the notion of coming to age. So when a young person is coming into adulthood. So their kind of mock date here kind of mimics the way an older couple would go on a date, but not quite, right? So it's kind of like a childlike version of a date. So Anne probes Peter's feelings throughout the conversation. The big thing is she's trying to see whether or not he's actually interested in her, or if he's just using her because she's the only girl available because they're stuck in this small enclosed space. So she asks him questions. She asks him what he'll do when he leaves, if he'll be busy hanging out with his other friends. He mentions he doesn't really have any friends. And then she asks him about kissing and that whether or not he's kissed anyone before. And they have this long conversation back and forth where they both basically explain they've never really kissed anyone. He's apparently kissed someone at a party playing a game, some sort of a kissing game. He doesn't go into too many details, but neither of them have really had any relationships, which makes sense because they're both fairly old or fairly young. Anne was 13 when she came to the annex. I think she's 15 by this point. And Peter is a few years older. I think he might be 16 when it starts. I think he's 18 when the play ends. But this demonstrates a lot of Peter's personality characteristics. The fact that he doesn't have a lot of friends. He's awkward. He lacks confidence. During the conversation, he mentions that he doesn't think he's very smart. He actually refers to himself as being stupid. And then at the very end of their date, he awkwardly kisses Anne on the cheek. And also other things you know about Peter, he has trouble maintaining control over his emotions when he's angry. And we've seen that with him and Dussel and his interactions with his father. Anytime he gets angry, he kind of slips over his words and he can't speak properly. The scene ends with Peter giving Anne a kiss. She leaves fairly early, around 9 o'clock, I think. There's a clock outside that they hear ring, and she knows that's her signal that she has to leave. She's really happy about the kiss. So, in fact, she's so happy when she leaves, she goes and says goodnight to her parents. She's just extremely giddy. and she gives Miss Van Dam a hug. Miss Van Dam takes this as proof that she was right, that inappropriate things were happening in that room, and she's almost like happy that she found out that she was right about her feelings. Um, Anne mentions at the end that she doesn't view herself as being in love with Peter, but she does mention that she lives for their meetings. So like it's kind of like an escape for Anne. So she's not like using him, but like she doesn't have the deep emotional feelings that he might be developing for her. And again, she doesn't know his mind. And since the plays through her viewpoint, we're not sure what Peter thinks exactly. But she's using him more as a an escape of their situation. Another important thing that happens in this scene, which becomes very important for the next scene, is dramatic irony. And we know that Anne thinks mice or rats are stealing food. And she's mentioned this has happened before. Now, we know this isn't actually rats. We know this is actually Mr. Van Dam stealing. And this is the playwright using uh, this scene to develop some anxiety or a sense of tension. And as promised, next scene, we actually get to see the repercussions of all the stealing. Hi, Joey. I just saw that you popped on. Okay, so that's the important parts for scene 2. I know I'm going pretty quick, but I pretty much need to get done with scene 3 today too. So if you have any questions, because I really shortened that, as opposed to how drawn out these sessions typically go. But I do want to get scene 3 done today too. That way, when we take that week off for spring break, you don't forget what we've gone over. So scene 3, act 2 is also on the Google Classroom. So you can go over the notes that I'm going over, either as I'm talking or you can always go over it at your own convenience. So scene 3 begins with Mr. Van Dam stealing food again. Now this time he doesn't get away with it. This time Mrs. Franks wakes up in the middle of the night, sees him stealing food, and starts screaming. So everyone comes into the room. They see what he's doing, and all the characters have like very strong reactions to his disgrace, right? So Mr. Van Dam doesn't really defend himself. Dussel tries to strangle him and eventually rustles away the bread that he had stole. Mr. Frank remains calm. Peter remains fairly silent, but Mrs. Van Dam tries to make excuses for her husband. She's always been kind of an enabler for all of his bad qualities. Even after he steals her coat and tries to sell it for cigarettes, she doesn't really remain angry with him for very long. They kind of pick back and forth, but she always kind of sticks up for her husband, and she kind of enables his bad actions from time to time. So this time's no different. When he gets caught, she tries to defend her husband's actions by saying that he's a bigger man, so he needs more food, and they're not being fair to him to treat him so. Mr. Dussel's reaction is pretty violent. He tries to strangle him. He eventually pries away the bread. Mrs. Frank's the one who really has the big change, though. So this entire scene's really about Mrs. Frank, who up to this point Anne hasn't really had a good relationship with and hasn't really talked a lot about her mother in a positive light. A few times she's mentioned that she wishes that they had a better relationship, and she is remorseful for how she treats her mother, but they don't have a good relationship up to this point. They rarely talk unless the mother's telling Anne to do something, and then they typically argue. Anytime Anne needs comfort, she goes to her father instead. But in this instance, we get some character growth from Mrs. Frank, and she becomes a very dynamic character and a round character in this scene. So up to this point, she's been very timid, very quiet, but once she sees that Mr. Van Dam's been stealing food, she becomes very aggressive, and she becomes confrontational. She kind of takes charge of the entire scene. She demands that the Van Dams leave. She berates Mrs. Van Dam for sticking up for her husband, who she says isn't really a man. She basically says they have to get out. She's willing to let them stay for a short period of time until Meep or Mr. Crawler can find them somewhere else to go. But she's pretty adamant that Mr. Van Dam can never come into the main room again. He needs to stay in his room, and people have to just take him food when he needs to eat. Mr. Frank tries to calm her down, and she just completely shouts him down, and Mr. Frank's quiet at this point. So we see a lot of growth from Mrs. Frank. Up to this point, Mr. Frank has been the leader of the group, and now Mrs. Frank has kind of taken charge. So the reason for her taking charge like this is her kids are in danger, right? So she knows her kids don't have food. They have a small amount of food that they're trying to stretch among 8 people. At one point, they had 3 ration books, but they lost those. So now they're only getting what Meep can provide them. So presumably they're taking the same food that Meep's eating. So they're sharing probably between Meep, Mr. Crawler, and the 8 of them, like a very small amount. So the fact that the kids are going hungry, and now she knows that Mr. Van Dam's been stealing, it's just too much for Mrs. Frank to take, and she just lets go, kind of like a mother bear getting a hold of someone who's messing with her cubs. So she just becomes full-on mama bear and takes charge of the situation. So the result of her taking charge of the situation is that Dussel feels himself elevated as well. So he starts dividing the food evenly. Mrs. Van Dam very quickly stops trying to argue with Mrs. Frank and kind of just gives up. Mr. Van Dam is completely quiet. When he first got caught, he mentioned that he was hungry, but then he doesn't talk again for a long time. So he doesn't defend himself, which is fairly interesting because up to this point, anytime someone's confronted him, he's come back very angry. Like when Dussel had confronted him, when Peter had confronted him, he had responded with anger. At this point, though, he knows he's wrong, and he just kind of gives up. So he doesn't defend himself whatsoever. Now, it looks like this would be a very depressing scene, but the bell rings and Meep shows up, and she kind of interrupts all of this collapsing morale. And with some really good timing, she tells them that the Allies have begun their invasion of D-Day. D-Day is when the Americans in June invade France off the coast of Normandy. So if you look on a map and you see where England and France are, there's just a short little channel in between the two. That's where the Americans are landing. So that lets us know that we're definitely in June of 1944. Now we know the German surrender in May of 45. So there's less than a year from this point to when the Nazis are completely out of power and the concentration camps would have been liberated. But we also know how the play ends. So like it just kind of makes the play a little bit sadder, the fact that they were so close to being rescued when everything bad goes wrong, and which is, again, dramatic irony. So anyways, in the excitement of knowing that the Americans are coming, and the British and the Poles and the French are all kind of uniting and fighting against the Nazis, during this, everyone kind of just forgets about Van Dam being banished. Mr. Frank actually hugs Mr. Van Dam. Dussel hugs Mrs. Van Dam, which is interesting because the two of them had just been arguing about the size of potatoes a second earlier. Peter parades around the room, banging pots and pans. Anne and Margo start singing. So you just have this big celebratory scene, right? So it begins very upsetting. We find out that Mr. Van Dam's been stealing. Mrs. Frank has character growth where she takes charge of the situation and is going to banish him and get him kicked out. The morale's kind of collapsed. Mr. Frank, for the first time, isn't able to convince everyone to work together and stick together. And then Meep kind of shows up and saves the day, letting everybody know that the Allies are beginning their invasion on Europe as a whole. So why is this chapter important? Right. So one of the main reasons this chapter is important is it has character growth for Mrs. Frank. Hi, Tristan. And it also has character growth for Mr. Van Dam. So after the celebrations going on for a while, someone mentions to Mr. Van Dam that it's okay now, like basically like you're forgiven, it's okay. But he says he can't forgive himself. He expresses a lot of shame, a lot of remorse. He talks about how he was stealing from children, almost like that notion that what he was eating was directly taking food away from what would have went to Anne, Margo, and his son Peter. So the fact that he remains so remorseful and the fact that he actually has some inner growth marks him as a dynamic character because his personality changed, right? He went from being very selfish, very greedy, caring only about himself, to all of a sudden realizing what he's done has negatively hurt other people. So because he shifts from being selfish to being remorseful, he's dynamic. The same way Mrs. Frank goes from being timid and quiet to being forceful and in charge, that makes her dynamic. So they both have character growth. Mrs. Frank's character growth comes from a better place. It comes from the need to protect the children, whereas Mr. Van Dam's comes from a mistake he makes and realizing how awful of a mistake he's been making up to this point. So they both grow at this point. So they both become dynamic characters, which is kind of interesting. Most people are going to say that Mr. Van Dam is actually the antagonist of the play because he was the one stealing the food. He was the one who stole his wife's jacket to sell for cigarettes. He was the one who kind of made fun of Peter when his cat was missing for him to kick his cat out. So he's kind of been like the jerk this entire time. And Mrs. Van Dam hasn't done too much better. She's kind of always antagonizing Mrs. Frank or enabling Mr. Van Dam. So both of the Van Dams kind of come across as kind of like the bad guys in the play almost. But really, like with this character growth we're seeing, it's not so much the antagonist is a person at all. It's the situation, which is the antagonist. The fact that they're stuck in this tiny attic, the fact that they're stuck up here and forced to live so close together with a small amount of food, the situation is really the antagonist. Hi, Tristan. Glad you can make it. So I'm not sure when you popped on. If you missed any of this, I put the notes on the Google Classroom, so you can see all the notes I went over. Even added a few pictures for you guys this time. There's also the play version, the audio version, and the text version. You can always go back and read as well. So the last big thing for this scene is Anne's character development. The entire book's from her perspective, and the book is what was used to create the play. So for the most part, we're getting information from her viewpoint. So we get some development from Anne. She expresses regret for how she's treated her mother. So in the last chapter, she looked down upon her mother because she couldn't stand up for herself. But in this chapter, the mother does stand up for herself, right? So she doesn't even really stand up for herself. She stands up for Anne and Margo. So Anne runs over and hugs her mother, demonstrates some affection. She apologizes for how she's talked to her. So even though Mrs. Frank wasn't doing this to impress Anne, she does impress Anne by sticking up for her. The news for the invasion, after the character development, we find out at the very end of the scene where Anne's just kind of recapping information, we find out that in July, the fight the Nazis and the Allies are having is kind of stalled in France. So around July, the Nazis are kind of stiffening their resistance and the Allies are having trouble pushing across. So what looked like it might be a very quick war looks like it might take a little bit longer. We know it takes about a year for the Americans to fully force the Nazis to surrender, so they still have about a year at this point. And we also find out that Mr. Crawler, who's been sick, is actually having surgery in the hospital, and that looks pretty bad, so they're kind of worried that he might die. They also learn that the Gestapo, and that's the secret police for the Nazis, have located the missing radio. So that radio that was stolen all the way back in Act 1, Scene 5 by the thief who heard them upstairs when Peter fell, that's coming back into play because the Gestapo has located the radio. Presumably, they found out about the radio being located because they're above the factory, so you would assume the police let the people in the factory know, so that's probably how the Franks found out. Dussel's very concerned that if the Gestapo was able to find the radio, they'll eventually be able to find the thief, and if they're able to find the thief will probably tell the Gestapo that he heard noises up there, so there are probably people hiding, and then that would possibly get them caught. So Dussel shows his fear again in this situation. Everybody else is kind of just resigned to the fact that they have nowhere to go. If you remember, Dussel was only supposed to stay here for a few weeks. Dussel's been here for over a year at this point. So it sounds like, well, it appears as though Mr. Crawler and Meep are unable to find anywhere else to hide anyone, especially with the Nazis being engaged with the Allies at this point and the Americans. There's a lot of just fear and paranoia throughout Norway. So trying to find a new place to hide at this point would probably be very difficult. This scene also ends with Anne being 15, so we know we've been in the annex for about 2 years because she was 13 when this started. So they've been here for roughly a year and a half by this point, I believe. So that's the end of this scene. On Thursday, I'll go over scenes 3 and 4. I won't have to rush as much for those because scene 5 is, I think, 2 pages. So it's really short. So scene 4 is the last really, really long scene. And if you remember back to the beginning of the play, the very first act and first scene was really short because it was really just Mr. Frank coming there, finding the scarf, finding the diary, and then kind of remembering all this because this, again, is all just like a flashback that Mr. Frank's remembering from his time there. Because, again, dramatic irony, we know what's going to happen. So for anyone who showed up late, if you go to the Google Classroom, you'll notice I put both of the summaries for scene 3 and scene 2 up. I put a graphic organizer, and that's a critique of Anne's relationship with Peter, where you get to critique the positives and negatives of their relationship. You can think of some positives and some negatives probably. If you're having trouble thinking of any of the negatives, go back to what Miss Van Damme was saying about their relationship, and you can find some negatives there. You can also find some positives there, and for the most part, and Margo tell you the different positives that the relationship is having on both Peter and Anne. There's also a quiz for Act 2, Scene 3, and a quiz for Act 2, Scene 2. So complete those when you get a chance. I think the last 2 things on there is a short vocabulary review, and that's one of those ones where you just read the sentence, use context clues to determine what the words mean, and then a character trait graphic organizer where you just go in and fill out what primary character trait you think that each character displays. So I think you're supposed to do 2 per character. So I think I did Mr. Frank or Mrs. Frank for you, and I listed 2 characteristics. Then for evidence, I told you why that character displays that. So none of them seem like they should take you too long, and they're similar to things we would have done in class, if not for the whole coronavirus nonsense. So I will be back on Thursday. Anyone who has a question, I know Nico, I think you had a question. So if you have a question, feel free to stick around, and I will answer that. So Meep is a good guy, Tristan. Meep is the 18-year-old girl who is helping Mr. Crawler get them supplies and keep them hidden in the annex. So while Mr. Crawler's sick, she's also kind of taking charge of the factory as well. Since it's been about a year and a half by this point, I would assume she's like 19 or 20. Meep's also one of the only people who survive till the end of the play. Only Mr. Frank, Meep, and Mr. Crawler live. No, I think she dies when she's 16. She's 15 at this point. So I'm thinking she's 16. She dies a few months before she's rescued by the Americans. I forget the name of the concentration camp she's at. It's not Auschwitz. It's another one of the big ones. I think it begins with an M. And I want to say she dies a month or 2 before she's liberated. I know Peter dies days before he's liberated, which is even more tragic because he was actually in the same camp as Mr. Frank. So Mr. Frank saw him being led away a few days before he was rescued. Yeah, Margo must have been 18 because I think the sisters are 2 years apart. So, and I'm not sure when Margo dies. I know she dies also, but I don't remember that offhand. We could probably look it up. I know that Anne dies something like a month or 2 before she would have been liberated, and her camp was liberated by the Americans. I'm not sure if Mr. Frank gets liberated by Russians or Americans, but I know the camp that liberates Anne's is the Americans. I did not get a haircut. Thanks for asking. I trimmed my beard a little bit. And I got on my favorite Hawaiian shirt. Too bad Mr. Fostnight's not here because I know he likes purple so much. But yeah, did you guys have any questions about the assignments on the webpage? I do not drink coffee. Coffee is for old people. This is just water. I guess you can't really tell. That's water. I generally don't drink anything but water or occasionally pop. Coffee's for old people. So like Mr. Fostnight, Mr. Sirianni, their age. All right. If there's no more questions, I'm going to sign off. Remember, if you have any questions on the Google Classroom stuff, you can actually like message me from that. I think a lot of you guys have my my email. You can always email me on that too, the work email. So either one if you get stuck. I know like it can look like there's a lot of work on the Google Classrooms coupled with your or your, what do they call a packet they send home, the packet of stuff they send home with you. So I know it seems like a lot. So if you start to get overwhelmed, take a break, try to enjoy yourself some, but try to get like some work done every day. And yeah, stay safe. Hopefully I'll see you guys in May. Otherwise, I'll be back on here on Thursday. Talk to you later.